Good morning. It's the first Sunday in November. This is the Maloney Pines class, and I'm John Kuykendall. We use the uniform lesson series. And this quarter, the uniform lesson series has been focused upon love for one another. There have been three sections to it. The first section, which was the month of September, had to do with struggles with love. And it was primarily taken from the book of Genesis, the story of Abraham and Isaac, the story of Joseph saga, his encounter with his brothers and with his father, and all the complicated relations there. So struggles was the first theme having to do with love. October, the second theme was inclusive love. And it had to do with love for others, love for your enemies, love for your neighbors. And then last Sunday, Van Leer gave us a good lesson on 1 Corinthians 13, which is a so-called hymn of love, which most of us know as well as we know anything in the Bible except perhaps the 23rd Psalm. And she told us about how that fit into the life of a very cantankerous community of Christians in the metropolitan area of Corinth, and how Paul, either having written this before or having borrowed this from someone else, put in this remarkable hymn concerning the primacy of love in the Christian life. Now, for the month of November, we're going to do something fairly different. This month, we have to do with God's love among believers in particular. And today's lesson is going to be one which will be fairly interesting for us in several ways. The lesson for today is the first part of the 13th chapter of the Gospel of John, John 13, 1 through 15, and then two verses toward the end of that chapter. So it's going to be a kind of a different thing than we've done before. And I want to say a few words in introduction about the Gospel of John. We haven't studied John in a while in this class, and so it perhaps is worth a little refresher as to what the book of John is all about. One of the first things to say about it is it's the fourth gospel, but it is quite different from the other three. The other three, you may recall, are called the synoptic gospels, and that word means the look-alike gospels. And they're called that because the material in those gospels is very common. Scholars have figured out various ways in which the three writers interacted with each other, but they had basically a storyline to go on, which was all the same. But we come to the Gospel of John, and we come to something quite different. One of the early church fathers called the Gospel of John the spiritual gospel because it has a kind of an aura of mysticism about it in some ways. It's not as direct and straightforward and narrative-oriented as the first three Gospels are. The writer of the Gospel of John is doing something quite different. Instead of having parables, as you find in the other three Gospels, the writer of the Gospel of John has what we refer to as discourses. These are long sermonic expressions of Jesus' basic understanding of the faith, Jesus' understanding of how he relates to the Father, how he relates to believers, how believers relate to the Father. All these interconnections are part of the reflection of these sermonic discourses that we find in the fourth Gospel. Another point of difference is in the Gospels, synoptic Gospels, we find miracles scattered throughout, and the word which is used for miracles in those first three Gospels is dunamis, a word from which we get dynamite, and it means acts of power, explosive acts on the scene. When we look at the Gospel of John, instead of dunamis, we have what John refers to, the Greek word is semia, and that means signs. And in the Gospel of John, there are 7 miraculous happenings, only one of which really interacts entirely precisely with the other three Gospels, and that's the feeding of the 5,000. But each one of these miracles, some of which happen distinctly only in John, each one of these miracles is a sign of something to come. And most of the time, the discourse which follows or sometimes precedes the sign expresses what the sign is really all about. So John is a much more theological document in some ways than the first three Gospels. Other things differ about the Gospel of John, of course. In the Gospel of John, for example, you find the cleansing of the temple right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, whereas In the other three Gospels, it's right at the end of Jesus' ministry, as he is in Jerusalem on the last few days of his life. So a lot of things change about the Gospel as opposed to the other. Now, the Gospel of John is divided into two sections. Rudolf Bultmann, the famous New Testament scholar, referred to these as two books. He spoke, first of all, of the book of signs, and then, secondly, of the book of the Passion. Now, the book of signs consists of the first 12 chapters of the Gospel of John, and it is bracketed by these 7 semeion, or signs that come up, the last of which is the raising of Lazarus, just before Jesus comes into the city of Jerusalem for the final few days of his life. So the book of signs is there, chapters 1 through 12. Then the book of the Passion begins in chapter 13, and it goes through the rest of the gospel through chapter 21. Chapter 21 is a different story. Somebody else will tell you that someday. But the story of the last days of Jesus' life is bracketed in chapters 13 through 20. And it's an interesting thing to note that the first 5 of those chapters, chapters 13 through 18, are all set in the context of a meal that Jesus is having with his disciples, to which we will turn in just a minute. But that meal that Jesus is having with his disciples, which, by the way, seems not to be a Passover meal. It seems to be a meal which is kind of a commemorative, celebratory meal, but there is no distinctive breaking of the bread and pouring of the wine as you find in the other 3 Gospels. So it's quite a different kind of a setting. But our particular passage that we have to read for today is right at the beginning of the book of the Passion, right at the beginning of the 13th chapter. And let's read this together. In your lesson book, it's on page 50, and I'll read it fairly slowly, and then we'll come back and we'll pick out the various parts of special interest. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Take notice of that. Jesus knew that his hour had come. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, he had put on his robe and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you." Then skipping on over several verses, most of which have to do with the situation with Judas Iscariot and his departure to do his evil deed. Then we come back to this in the 34th verse. "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." That's the end of our scripture reading. Now, first of all, probably want to get something out of the way in a hurry, and that has to do with this business of foot washing. When I was a student in theological seminary, between my second and third year of seminary, I was given the opportunity to go to a small mining community, well, actually two mining communities in the eastern part of Kentucky, right where West Virginia and Kentucky come together. It's called Majestic, Kentucky, and in some ways it was anything but a majestic place, although the people there were absolutely wonderful. Well, Missy and I went up there, and most of what I did, and she was a willing accomplice in much of this, most of what I did was to run Bible schools scattered all over the hills and up the hollers, and little churches, not necessarily the Presbyterian congregations which I was serving, but little churches all over the area, and they allowed us to use their facility to hold a weekday Bible school for 1 week. Well, one of the places we went, which was in a very, very remote holler, back up a creek bed that I had to drive an old International Harvester truck up in order to get there, we came into this church building, which we were going to use, and the little kids from the neighboring community were going to come in and meet us there. We walked in, and I walked up toward the front, up toward the pulpit, and there was a kind of a raised dais there at the first, and tucked up underneath, almost as though they were stored, were a whole bunch of dish pans. Must have been 12 or 15 of them, just stuffed up under the stage. And of course, I, being as naive as I was, said, "What's all this?" Well, my friend said, "This is a foot washing Baptist church. They wash each other's feet every Sunday." I've never been exposed to foot washing before. I guess I've read this passage in the Bible, but I've never thought a whole lot about it. But this particular brand of the Baptist church in Appalachia and in other places has a regular practice of observing the sacrament, or ordinance they would call it, of foot washing as a very basic part of what they do. Now, foot washing is not really reserved simply for the Baptist up in the hills of Appalachia. Foot washing is something which takes place in other Christian communities as well. On Maundy Thursday, the Thursday before Easter, the Pope, traditionally for many years, the Pope washes the feet of the servants who are nearest to him, and also then washes the feet of poor people, sometimes the feet of prisoners, as an act of service to them, showing that he is supposed to be the servant of all the servants of God. Also, in our own congregation and other Presbyterian and mainline Protestant congregations, from time to time on Maundy Thursday, we practice foot washing, and it's an optional thing frequently in many congregations. And sometimes, if you don't want to get into the foot washing part of things, you can simply have an anointing of oil on your head instead of getting down and washing somebody else's feet or having your feet washed. But this turns out to be a very basic part of John's understanding of who Jesus is with respect to his disciples. And look at the last two verses that we read. That's really the significant part of this whole thing. Listen once again. "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So that's kind of the basis for this whole practice of foot washing. Now, let's take the verses of this particular passage that we have, and let's kind of pull them apart one by one. Foot washing is there at the center of everything, as we've said, but there are other things that are pretty important about this particular passage. Foot washing was common in Jesus' day. It was something which was done by any good host when a visitor came into his home. But it was some which was not done by the host. It was usually done by one of the servants or one of the slaves in the family. And it was an act of courtesy on the part of the host, but it was also an act of subservience on the part of the servant or the slave to get down and wash the person's feet. Because in the ancient Middle Eastern world, and still today, the feet are looked upon as something which are kind of basically unclean, and you need to stay away from. You may be familiar with some of the rituals of Islam, in which the worshiper on any given day, when he comes to worship, will wash his own feet in order to be clean enough to go to worship. And you also may be familiar with the way in which feet and shoes are used as instruments of opprobrium in the Near and Middle Eastern world. You may recall some years ago, one of our presidents went to Iraq, and one of the journalists in the room who was particularly angry at what our president said, picked up his shoe and threw it at him, which was a sign of great disrespect. So this matter of dealing with your feet is something which is kind of sensitive in that part of the world. Now, here's Jesus saying, first of all, that his hour has come. That is to say, he realizes that he is about to die. So the things that he says and the things that he does in these next several chapters of the book of John have particular significance. This is kind of a farewell discourse, it's sometimes called. This is kind of Jesus' way of giving his last lecture, of saying to these friends of his, this is what I leave with you. This is what I want you to do. Now, interestingly enough, as I mentioned earlier, this meal at which Jesus stands up in the middle of the meal and does this remarkable act in going around as the servant and washing the feet of all of his disciples, this meal is not necessarily a Passover meal, or if it is, John doesn't think it's important to say this. The significant thing about this meal is that there is this radical reversal of roles. The master becomes the servant. The rabbi becomes the one who is in position of his students. And Jesus does this almost instantaneously, to the great surprise of the people who are there. Now, two other characters of significance in this first part of the narrative. One of them is, of course, our friend Peter. I've always thought that Peter, as wonderful as he was and as much leadership as he must have provided to the early church after the death and resurrection of Jesus, Peter was a little bit slow of foot in terms of catching up with what was happening. Remember, it was Peter at the time of transfiguration in the Synoptic Gospels who said, when Elijah and Moses showed up, he said, Jesus, we ought to stay up here. We need to build 3 tents up here, and let's just stay at the top of the mountain. And Jesus said, that's not what we're about. Peter's a little slow on the uptake. And this time, when Jesus comes around and wants to wash his feet, Peter said, you're not going to do that. You're my master. I am your servant. You're not supposed to be doing that. So Jesus reacts, Peter reacts because he must think too much of Jesus at this point. Well, Jesus said, if I don't do this, you have no part of me. In other words, you're not really my disciple if you don't let me do this. Whereupon Peter says, well, don't just wash my feet, wash my whole body. Clean me from head to toe. And Jesus said, man, you missed it again. Here, it looks like Peter is guilty of too much piosity or religiosity here. Peter wants to say, okay, I really need it, so give it all to me. You wash these other guys' feet, do everything for me. I want the whole show. And Jesus said, once again, you missed the point. If you've had a bath, it's only your feet I want to wash. I want to tell you that he who is going to be greatest among you is going to have to be your servant. That part is important, the Peter-Jesus interaction. Other thing that's important here in this early part of this narrative has to do with the man who is about to betray him. Now, if we'd had the whole passage before us today, as I said to you earlier, the thing that we would have seen after Jesus finished his foot washing is this exchange with Judas Iscariot, in which the beloved disciple, many people think this is John, the son of Zebedee, but we really don't know. But the beloved disciple who is right next to Jesus said, who's going to betray you? And Jesus said, it's going to be the person that I dip the bread in the cup and hand it to. Now, this is not the same thing as the ritual of the Lord's Supper in any respect. Jesus just does what the host of the table usually do. Passes a piece of bread to one of the people sitting at the table. He does everybody eventually. But when he hands it to Judas Iscariot, he makes it clear to the beloved disciple that this is about what's to happen. And then almost immediately he says to this man, Judas, that which you have to do, go do it quickly. Well, since he's the treasurer of the outfit, beware of treasurers, everyone, but since he's the treasurer of the outfit, everybody thinks he's going out to buy the provisions necessary for the Passover feast or to give some money to the poor. And so out he goes into the night. And this is kind of symbolic of the fact that the wheels have been set in motion for that which leads eventually to the cross. So here we have these two people, disciples, Peter and Judas, one of them wanting too much, Judas receiving the foot washing, and even though he is the one who is about to betray this master who has become his servant. So there's a lot of interplay going on here between and among these people. So here we have this remarkable story of Jesus becoming the servant, the reversal of roles here, and then those two verses there at the end, which we read, in which Jesus tells all these disciples to go and do likewise. They're supposed to do this to one another. So here we have a kind of a basis for discipleship within community. Now, I've often wondered, perhaps you haven't, but I've wondered why it is that this foot washing action hadn't become one of the sacraments in the Christian community. Remember, perhaps you remember, during the time of the Protestant Reformation, one of the things that happened with regard to the restructuring of worship of the church among Protestants is they looked at the 7 sacraments which were appropriate within the Catholic tradition. Don't ask me to name them all, but I could if you push me hard enough. But there were 7 sacraments. They looked at these sacraments and they said, the sacraments have got to be only those things which Jesus has required us to do. They referred to them as the dominical sacraments because Jesus was Dominus. Jesus was the Lord. And these are the things the Lord told us to do. They are, as you well know, the sacrament of baptism, the entry into the Christian community, and the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the sacrament that we celebrate in Holy Communion. Jesus especially said to his disciples, you find it in the synoptic traditions, do this. He said, go into all the world and baptize in my name at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. He said in the narratives of the other Gospels, when he did celebrate the sacrament, he said, do this in remembrance of me. So he's telling them you've got to do these 2 things. The third thing that he essentially tells his disciples to do is to wash one another's feet. And you know, we've never quite gotten around to doing that in the Christian community. It's a remarkable thing that we haven't, but it's done only on special occasions. It's done with special significance, but except for those Baptists up in the hills of Kentucky, and not a whole lot of people who do it on a regular basis. Certainly, we don't keep dishpans up under the chancel in our congregation, nor do many other people that I know of. But here we have Jesus kind of setting the stage for this idea of the love within the Christian community. We've talked about love of all people. We've talked about love of enemy. We've talked about love of others around us. We've talked about love of neighbors. And now in this final portion of our discussion of love, we come to talk about love of the brothers and sisters with whom we share Christian communion. Now, I don't want to get too preacherly about this, but think about it. We're told to love one another within the Christian community. And the place where we enjoy Christian community in a most intimate and personal way is within the congregation of the church. We're not on Zoom so that I can see you and you can see me, but raise your hand if you have ever been in a Christian church in which there were expressions of dissension or difficulty, in which people found it somewhat hard to love one another. It could be about the most trivial things. I was in a church once in which the controversy and the harsh words were focused upon the fact that some people wanted to air condition the Sunday school building and some people didn't. But all sorts of things can come up. Do we want to paint the church now or do we not? Do we want to have a service in the church which conflicts with Sunday school or not? All sorts of things. I've been in 4 or 5 congregations, and I have to say, as wonderful as they were as kind of focal points for my life and my appreciation of Christian faith, there's never been a one of them that didn't have some sort of controversy somewhere which caused people to strain the bonds of Christian love and fellowship within the community. It's just our nature as human beings. But the other side of this has to be the insistence that we have on the part of the Lord of the church to come together and to see to it that we are one body and expressive of his will for us as well as we can. I want to tell you one more story before I stop. And well, maybe I want to tell you one other thing before that, and that is I ran across a quote just recently from the early church father whose name was Tertullian, who was talking about the church and about the tensions which sometimes exist among Christians in life together in community. And he said that the church is something like Noah's Ark, that if it weren't for the storm outside, you probably couldn't stand the smell inside. Now, that was a little tough, but anyway, he was letting us know that there are reasons that we're gathered together despite whatever difficulties may come while we're living as part of the body of Christ in a local church. Well, one other story I want to tell you before I stop, and that has to do with a dear friend of mine who's not quite a Christian, probably wanted to be at one time be a Christian. In fact, he wanted to be enough that he went to a theological seminary in order to kind of test out this business called Christianity. In good conscience, at least so far in his life, I don't think he's come to embrace that as the faith of his life. But he told me a story one time that really, really touched me with regard to this passage that we just read for today. He was a student in a divinity school, and he was studying for exams during the Easter season, stayed up late at night. He was sitting in his room in the dormitory all by himself, and there was a knock on his door. It was Maundy Thursday, it happened to be, though I'm not sure my friend was aware of that, but he opened the door, and there stood one of his neighbors on the hall, somebody he didn't know particularly well, with a basin and a towel. And he said to my friend, "I would like to wash your feet." So he came in, my friend took off his shoes and socks and put his feet into the basin. The man kindly, tenderly washed his feet very carefully, dried them off, picked up the basin and the towel, and left the room. And my friend said to me that that was the most profound expression and experience of Christianity that he'd ever had. Wouldn't it be something if all people all around us were aware of the fact that we either symbolically or in reality are there to wash their feet? Well, that's enough for this Sunday. My best to all of you. Remember to set your clocks back an hour. You didn't have to get up quite so early for Sunday school this morning, but probably most of you already knew that. Have a good week.